So, for those of you just joining us, this is going to be a lecture on radio revolution. In other words, the North Pacific's Ministry of Radio and how you can implement a similar program in your region. So, to begin, I'd say the Ministry of Radio within the North Pacific represents one of the greatest leaps forward for our region, at least in my personal opinion. We've got voice chats that become recorded podcasts that build community and improve recruitment and training for our region. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start this lecture by digging into the history of NBS, how this entire program got started. I'll discuss its incredible potential to improve the region and explain how to organize shows, discuss the challenges that we have faced in setting this up, and close by once again encouraging you to start similar programs in your region if you haven't already. So, I'm sure not everyone here is entirely aware what NBS is, so I'll begin with that. NBS is the Northern Broadcast Service. It's a podcast platform that was founded several years ago in the North Pacific. Each of the early shows represent snapshots in our history and covered election and other news on essentially a monthly basis. Speakers included Yalkin, Darkania, Brendog, and others. These are important people from TNP's past, and interestingly, many are still active to this day. Basically, the Ministry of Radio didn't exist for the longest time. It was just NBS, which was a program under the Ministry of Communications, and activity surged and waned over time. Over the course of several years, I believe 10 or maybe 11 different podcasts were held, each coming and going as time went on. But ultimately, there wasn't a very consistent pattern of activity because, as we'll cover later, NBS requires a lot of skill and it's a really technically driven task. So that's sort of the history of NBS going back quite a long time. When I joined the region of the North Pacific, that is, back in, gosh, it would have had to have been 2017, probably? No, 2018? I'm going to get my dates confused here. It was probably 1 or 2 years ago when I joined the North Pacific at this point. It feels like such a long time. I'm sure someone's going to correct me in the chat. But when I first joined the North Pacific, the Ministry of Communications was sort of staying the course under the course of Brendog as Minister of Communications. He had essentially set up the Northern Lights to be what the North Star is today, and was regularly publishing the North Star, or the Northern Lights, on basically a monthly basis. But at that point, NBS had ceased to exist, essentially, and I had heard of the program tangentially from a former Minister of Communications by the name of Kashovia, and became incredibly interested in it. And so I learned as much as I could from him, and then I drew inspiration from the Ministry of Radio in Europia, the UCR, who's an ally of ours, and decided that it was something that I definitely wanted to pursue. So at that point, when I became Minister of Communications myself under Sawale's term in office, I decided that I would do my best to bring the Northern Broadcasting Service back. And what that meant was trying to find speakers to, talk about regional news. My original idea was just to bring it back on a monthly basis, the same way as it had been before, talking about election and other news. And so that's what we did. The first couple episodes were really choppy, and you can find those online. They're still on our YouTube channel. You can check those out. You can tell I wasn't nearly as confident in either the technical side or the voice chat side of things. And it's definitely a skill that you have to build up over time. So we got that started. It wasn't really a monthly basis. It sort of came and went as well as I either found time or didn't, or people weren't willing to speak, and there were scheduling issues and whatnot. But as time passed, it sort of grew in the region. Um, People started listening in to shows and whatnot. And we started expanding our reach, developing tutorial shows to help newer nations to nation states and the North Pacific sort of find their place. Um, and as we grew the shows, we realized just how much potential the Northern Broadcasting Service has. Um, we eventually expanded it to include all sorts of different things, and we have so much more planned. So I'll get into a little bit of that potential now. And for the record, this doesn't just apply to the North Pacific. I'm going to explain this in a way that I hope you can see will apply to many different regions, including all of the Pacifics. So first off, as I've already tried to introduce, there's a really wide variety of programming that you can put on your YouTube channel or whatever, what have you, in terms of podcasting to support your region. For instance, you can have election town halls, which the North Pacific is currently ongoing our general election period, and we actually went off and interviewed every single candidate this season. Which is pretty cool. So that helps inform voters. It leads to debates and both pre and post-election analysis, which we will probably get into. You can do regional satisfaction surveys, which are really helpful for the government as a whole to improve its executive or administrative running of the region, and you can analyze that in a video form to show transparency for those surveys and inform next steps for your administration. You could host weekly or monthly news shows to report on recent events, boost awareness for the public and for foreign relations. You could spread those via embassies if you would, and provide a more accessible approach to giving foreign updates, for instance. As I've already mentioned, there's nation states and TNP tutorials that can add or boost recruitment to the region. They can boost executive staff training. They can bolster mentorship programs. And they're really a great supplemental guide for both getting people into the region and getting them interested in basically our community. And then once they're here in the community, we can have community-oriented shows that build interest. For instance, we've hosted a number of role-play shows over the years. It's been years already, over the months, I'd say. Basically, the North Pacific is split up into several different role-play worlds, both on our regional message board and on our offsite forums. And we've given both Strange Reel, the regional message board roleplay, and Eris sort of a time of day to show off the wonderful roleplay communities that we've had or that we have in the North Pacific. And we even have a particular episode on the Aeneas Starfall roleplay that Pridania and others are currently working on. And we hope to expand that in the coming terms because there's so much more to do. There's just so much content that they produce. We can also create shows, and I'm not saying we've necessarily done all of these already, but there's so much potential here for both us and you to boost, for instance, interest in nation-states cards. There's a lot of complexity there. For instance, the North Pacific has a wide variety of awards that we offer for nations to do sort of simple tasks such as becoming Keepers of the North, which is endorsing our delegate, vice delegate, and Security Council, but also for supporting our World Assembly Development Program, widely endorsing everyone in the region, which boosts regional influence and security. It's a great program, but a lot of newcomers to the region are sort of confused about the different award levels that we offer, and holding videos on NS cards could sort of help boost that process even more. And moreover, it might help get more people building decks here in the North Pacific. Another way we could go about building these sort of community shows is we have, the North Pacific Army, our R&D branch. We recently held a series of shows during the first term of, was it the first term? Might have been this term, actually, of Mick Masterdonia's term in office, about basically the North Pacific Army Generals series, where we went out and interviewed each of the generals who were willing to speak on the shows, rather, and trying to boost recruitment. I don't know how much that really helped or how much that worked, but as long as that information is out there, it boosts awareness of the NPA. And moreover, that can go into tutorials as well. We don't want to give away OPSEC, of course, but perhaps teaching newer nations about R&Ding can help them get involved long term. We also have the games server. Basically, the potential is almost endless, as I hope you're noticing. All of these shows basically augment existing programs within the region and give them greater awareness and boost recruitment for these communities. And I've already listed a whole bunch of things, but actually two more just came to mind, which are, we also have the Northern Light, which is our basically regional journal, so to speak. It hasn't actually published in quite some time. I hope we're going to be able to start that up again. But we could boost publicity for those articles by reading them aloud, further improving accessibility. Or we could help augment TNP University courses by giving them another platform with which to debate ideas. So it's a huge program that I'm talking about. It requires a ton of effort, but it can give your region so much. So let's talk a little bit about the organization, because of course at this point you're kind of thinking, how can I do this? In what way can I create such an organization as NBS and the Ministry of Radio? And I never actually formalized this, I guess, but at some point during the course of our exploration of these various different topics, we realized that the Ministry of Radio really needed to be its own ministry. NBS was growing in size and in magnitude within the Ministry of Communications this entire time, and we were operating it alongside the North Star, the Northern Lights, and the Roleplay Reel, and it just came to be too much for any one person to handle as Minister of Communications. So it had to get split off into its own ministry, Ministry of Radio, which I helped found alongside Mick Masterdonia in his most recent term in office. And at this point, it's being led by Dredton, who's currently listening in, so he might be able to answer some of your questions as well later. I don't want to put him on the spot, of course. I'll take full responsibility if you have questions, but if he wants to chime in, he's welcome to. So at some point, yeah, we became the Ministry of Radio. I've posted our ministry seal in the conference chat. You can see it for yourself. So let's talk a little bit about that organization, as I just mentioned. As I've already discussed, the Ministry of Radio is really technology-driven. It has a much higher barrier to entry than other ministries do, just because it requires knowledge of recording, software, editing software, and then basically just some sort of video hosting or podcast hosting platform. In our case, we chose to use YouTube just because it's really easy to use. It's simple. It gives you basically auto-generated subscripts, and it's just a really well-known platform. So putting it out on YouTube seemed to make sense at the time. As far as recording goes, at this point, I guess we're using Craig in the chat for this particular one, which is the bot, but I typically use OBS Studio, which is typically used mainly on PCs, but there are plugins that you can use to make it work on Mac. As far as sound editing goes, there's really not that much that has to go into it. We're pretty much just making amateur podcasts. That's understood. The quality really doesn't have to be that high. You just want to make sure that your content is good. But if you are going to go into it and try to do some, very basic, primitive audio editing, one thing that you can do is just use a free program like Audacity. Put in your audio file into that. Just edit out big silences. Like, if in the natural course of a voice chat, you might have a question that you ask to someone who's being interviewed, and they might take a minute to think about it. And you don't want your listeners later to have to listen through the whole minute of silence that follows. So use Audacity to just clip that down to something like 3 seconds or something, so that they understand that there was a pause there, but it wasn't, a 5-minute pause or whatever. You can also edit out stupid things that you've said. I've never done that. Or you can add other, background music or whatever you want to make the track a little bit more interesting. At this point, I've typically just done podcasts and uploaded those, but you can expand this to to an actual video format. The way you would probably do that is just to record your screen on OBS. Maybe just record the chat so that any incoming questions seem pretty natural. If you're doing a role play themed show, people can post flags or pictures of characters, and those can get recorded. So there's definitely some potential there. At that point, though, you're going to have to start looking into an actual video editor. So iMovie's pretty basic, but gets the job done. I personally use Filmora, which unfortunately is paid, but I've had it forever, so I don't want to change it. And it's not great, so I don't really recommend it. And then you've got your more professional software, which is much, much more expensive. And honestly, I don't really recommend it. There's probably free options out there somewhere. You just have to find them. So as far as recording stuff goes, there's typically a very small number of people who have the skills to do it, and then it's just a question of making sure that they're present when needed. As far as finding speakers and whatnot, you have to consider that on nation states, we're not just, all sitting in one room. Everybody's got different time zones. We come from all over the world. So scheduling is probably the hardest single factor. You have to send reminders to people, you have to make pings or announcements to get people to listen, and of course not everyone likes that, so you have to sort of tread a little bit of a balance there. When you come up with a topic, you want to make it interesting. You want to probably provide a little bit of preparation for other speakers, maybe give some sort of outline to the questions that you're going to ask to give them a little bit of time to think about what they might say in advance. If you're going to interview someone, you don't have to do this necessarily. You can make it a little bit more off the cuff. But if you're going to talk about regional news or something, it might help to have a little bit of an outline with some subpoints. You don't want to go into too much detail. Don't write paragraphs on it or something to recite. We're not looking for a script. But you want bullet points to give people ideas about what to talk about. You want to make things interesting. And then once everything's ready, you've got your speakers all lined up. You've sent them a reminder to be there at a given time. You send your announcement to everybody in the region or wherever you are to join the voice chat or whatnot. You might want to give people special roles so that speakers are allowed to talk and everybody else has to be muted during the main portion of the event, just because otherwise you might have 20 people speaking over each other. And even though it's a primitive amateur broadcast, you don't want to have that because no one's going to be understood. So you definitely want to boost the visibility of voice chats and whatnot, have people participate, but you don't want to overdo it in that sense. And then once you're done with that, make sure that you're recording it, edit it if you're going to do any editing, but of course that's pretty optional. And then when you're finally done, upload it to YouTube. YouTube will automatically add the subtitles. It'll give you statistics that will allow you to optimize your video content, and maybe it'll give you new ideas. People comment on your videos, you can like those, you can participate a little bit there. As far as actually gaining like some sort of revenue source, you're not going to be able to get that just based on the simple economics of how many subscribers and hours watched videos on YouTube require in order to get sort of ads on them. But even then, I wouldn't personally be interested in that, especially from a nation state sense, because all we're trying to do is bolster our community. We're not looking to augment our forum funding or anything like that. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview on the organization. Of course, if you have questions later, I'll be very happy to answer them. So I've already talked a little bit about the challenges that go into this, primarily that it relies heavily on technological know-how. And I've went into a little bit of detail on the different programs that I use and that the Ministry of Radio uses to develop our shows. One thing that I will mention is that at least I found it helpful. I don't know if anyone else did, but I developed a set of staff tutorials that basically just walk through the basic process of downloading each of these and setting them up for the most basic use case for establishing a process to do these shows. So how to download OBS, how to download Audacity, how to make sure that you have the lame plugin. I think that comes in the newest versions of it now anyway, but it used to be a problem. How to get a basic video editing software, and then how YouTube works, if you want to call it that. I actually don't know if I did that last one. Maybe I should. But basically, it gives newcomers to the ministry something to start with that allows them to sort of get into this whole idea. Most of the newcomers, I would say, are probably most useful from a perspective of recording shows, because the problem with newcomers joining the ministry is that when you have people on voice chat, you want to make sure that they're some minimum level of competence in what they're talking about, some minimum amount of knowledge, because if you start recording people who don't know what you're talking about, then you're spreading false information, and you probably want to avoid that. Now, of course, as we're tied to the region, we're trying to promote regional events and whatnot, but we tried to maintain a certain amount of separation from each administration. We're not trying to influence elections or what have you. We're just trying to provide information. So there has to be some element of journalistic integrity there. At least we try to. Of course, if we get something wrong, we'll happily correct it later. We are trying our best. I guess another big challenge is that not everyone is comfortable on voice chat, so you have to respect their privacy. With our latest town hall series for the elections, while we did interview every single candidate, to the best of my knowledge at least, there were some people who didn't want to do that on voice chat, and we didn't want to single out certain candidates who weren't willing to do that. And so in order to, we basically just did it text-based, and we'll record it later or something like that. So you have to keep that in mind. And I would say that you want to encourage voice chats by just hosting them more frequently. They don't all have to be recorded. Just having them more often in your community makes people more comfortable with it. So ultimately, your ministry is going to benefit. Another challenge is that sometimes you have to be a little careful about what content you record, because there's sensitive topics out there that can cause controversy. So it's probably best to develop some regional policy on what you want to have on your platform versus what you should just, encourage other people to put on their own YouTube channels. Because the channel represents the region, having real-life politics or real-life religion is typically something that we try to avoid. I'm not saying it'll never happen, but there's definitely some common sense there. I've already mentioned scheduling being difficult with time zones and that pings can cause disruption or complaints. And another thing is that editing and exporting videos is a really time-consuming process, as Vivanco and Dredton found out in the past few days. So basically just give yourself plenty of time if you're going to go that route. So after all of this, I think it's pretty clear that despite the host of challenges that you're going to face, the Ministry of Radio has had a profound impact on the North Pacific's regional dynamic, and you should probably consider founding a similar program in your region. It has such a tremendous potential for regional improvement, and it almost immediately pays dividends on the time investment that you put in. And if that weren't enough, I would say that it actually is a really rewarding activity on its own merits and gives you skills that apply to real life if you want to develop it further. Thank you so much for your time. That was the contents of my lecture. I'll now happily answer any questions you have with my remaining time. Dredton asks, he's the current Ministry of Radio, how much weight should we give YouTube analytics? So it depends on the number of viewers that YouTube is suggesting that you have. If it says that you've had 1 or 2 views on a given video, don't take that to mean very much, because it's probably me. I definitely do have a habit of going back and listening to older videos that we've done, and I'm pretty sure other Ministry of Radio members have done the same at some point or another. I'm also not entirely sure what is considered a view on YouTube, whether that's, you know, staying for a second or staying for at least 5% of a video or whatnot. I think the most important thing to look at video analytics is, well, there's a number of important things. First off is unique viewers. That's a, you know, it eliminates these multiple watches per viewer thing that we've got going on, where I might watch the same video 30 times or whatever because I'm obsessed with myself speaking or whatever, which I'm not, but weirder things have happened. The other thing would be the average amount of time that a video is viewed. So if you have, you know, a 30-minute video and the average amount of listener time is 10 minutes, that's actually pretty good. Typically, it's a lot lower than that. So there's definitely an argument to shorten video length, and that's something that you could get from YouTube Analytics. You could say, well, it looks like, you know, the attention span here isn't nearly as good, so if we really want to promote these particular events or programs, we might want to shorten our videos. That's probably about as much stock as I would put into it, but there's definitely a lot more that you probably could, just by looking at if viewership is increasing over time, you can get trends from that and whatnot. All right. Art asks, what topics do you think are a must for podcasts like the North Pacific's? Well, I don't really know if there's anything that is actually a must-have. I mentioned that there's a zillion different things that you can do these shows about, but you don't have to make it about any one thing or about all of them. I mean, we could literally just make only roleplay shows, and that would be, you know, that would be a great thing to do. There's no actual requirement on that. So, yeah, take that how you will. I don't think there's any must-have. If you're going to start with anything, I think regional news or election news is probably the most engaging for the most number of people, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case depending on your region. All right, Teeman asks, I may be joining this conference late, but what is the main purpose of TNP Radio? I think what I would say is that the main purpose of NBS, or the Ministry of Radio, is to spread or improve community engagement and awareness for all of our programs. Or different, that's a terrible way of phrasing it. NBS's main purpose is to improve visibility and increase awareness of all of our communities and events. That's a better way of saying it. All right. Dolly asks, what have you guys noticed is generally the more popular topics for your radio shows? Okay, so you would not believe this because I am still super confused by this, but the NS tutorial series that I did, which just, I mean, it's the very basics. It's like how to answer issues, which if you can't figure that out, you know, I don't know what you're doing wrong, but you're doing something wrong, right? But like the super basics of just answering issues, how do you get involved in a region? Let's look at that regional handbook a little bit more. Let's look at, what the World Assembly is and a really brief introduction to it. Let's look at our Discord or our forums and try to just sort of get a little bit better sense about our community. Those videos are super popular, and I don't know why, but we literally have like 2x or maybe 3x as many views on those videos as we have on almost everything else. I would say that everything else is still pretty good. We probably have on average like 40 to 50 views on our other videos, and those are typically like roleplay or NPA Generals type shows or interviews of different, important people in our region. Tretid asks, how much time and manpower goes into something like NBS? So when the ministry was first founded, I was the only person in it as minister, and I did everything by myself. It's not something that you want to do all by yourself, but you can do it all by yourself, so long as you do find, people who are willing to speak, and you come up with interesting show ideas to, get an audience. As far as the amount of time, I would say it depends on what kind of show you're trying to do. If it's a tutorial, it's actually pretty quick. It only takes about an hour to write a fairly decent script, and then 5 minutes to record it. And then on the tutorial ones, I didn't even edit those. I just straight uploaded them. And uploading takes something like 5 to 10 minutes, and you don't even have to really be there for that part. And then you're done. So call it an hour and a half for a tutorial video. If it's something like our most recent town halls, those aren't nearly as bad as some of the shows that we've done, but basically what you do is if you're interviewing multiple different people on the same topic, what I personally believe is the best thing to do is to individualize each of their questions to get each of their own perspectives on it. So you're going to ask different follow-up questions, and maybe each of those people have a different background, so you'll dive into that background a little bit differently for each one. But what's honestly easier, especially if you are low on staff or low on time, which you always are, you can just make the same set of questions for every different person that you're interviewing. So for instance, for our delegacy elections, I probably spent probably about an hour coming up with questions, and then I asked different people within our Ministry of Radio to also contribute questions to that as well, and then I ordered those. So call it an hour to generate questions, and then I spent probably 1 or 2 hours scheduling everybody, because we had, it wasn't just the delegacy election, there were also the speaker and the vice delegacy election, so I had to organize everybody and find time for that over the weekend. I don't recommend doing like 10 shows in a weekend. That's not fun. But if you can do 1 or 2 shows in a weekend, that can be really productive. So call it an hour per show on average. And then as far as editing is concerned, thankfully I had some staff to back me up on that. So I had Vivanco do the editing. He created some interesting graphics and found some free music that he could put behind it. That's another important thing. Make sure your graphics are either your own, or that your music that you put behind it, if you're going to do that, is something that you have permission for, because otherwise YouTube is going to get all iffy with you on copyright. Vivanco probably spent an hour editing each show, and then he actually found that it took him, because the longer your show is, the longer it takes to export it if you have done any editing on it. So he found that it took him about 3 hours to export each show, which is a terribly long amount of time. And then to upload that would probably be something like half an hour. the whole process for each one of the shows is probably like 5 hours then, which is terrible. But a lot of that time is just sitting there waiting for it to export, which is, you don't have to be there for that. You could get up and go bike riding outside or whatever. You don't have to wait for it. But the problem is that it's taking a certain amount of your computer's resources, so you can't do a ton of stuff with your computer in the meantime. Like, I wouldn't do gaming at the same time as your files exporting. Another thing about that, I will note, just a technical thing, I have noticed sometimes that if you're exporting a video and you want it to upload to YouTube as well, some software packages will allow you to automatically upload to YouTube, but it'll have like a confirmation thing in the middle. If you like fall asleep on your laptop while it's exporting, it'll never get to the YouTube thing, and then it'll kill it and you have to do it all again the next morning. So just export it, upload it separately. All right. And then as far as manpower is concerned, currently we have, I would say, 3 very active members in the Ministry of Radio, and then probably a dozen people who contribute from time to time. But 2 or 3 people is really all you need. Art asks, do you record podcasts with live listeners? It depends. Sometimes people are comfortable with that. Sometimes people aren't. It takes a lot more effort just because you want to make sure that everything is really high quality when you do it so that it's interesting for your listeners. Whereas sometimes you're just doing a pretty relaxed show and you just want it to stay relaxed. So you'll do that in private, upload it later, and then post it later. I did all the tutorials independently by myself on my own time without a live audience, but almost all of our roleplay shows, our town halls, our election coverage, our news shows, that's all done with live listeners. Art also asks, how do TNPers view the Drew Nations? I don't want to speak on their behalf. I don't think I'm the right person to do that. I also don't want to put my words in anyone's mouth, so I will give you my thoughts on that, but keep in mind they are just my thoughts. I don't speak for the whole of the North Pacific. So my personal viewpoint is, despite the frustration that I've seen from others, I personally see it as a huge boon for nation states. Now, I'm not in the North Pacific Army. I don't have to deal with slow update times. I understand the struggles of others, but I personally see it as more people who can participate in our communities, who can become involved, who are, interesting people in their own right, I'm sure, and we'd love to have them, and that's all I have to say on that. I definitely think it's pretty cool. All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. If you have any, don't be afraid. Feel free to ask them. Now's the time. And it's exactly this kind of moment where you have a long pause between audience-submitted questions that having an editing program like Audacity is super helpful so that future listeners don't have to listen to this part. Another thing that you can do with Audacity is edit out anytime someone says the word Don't necessarily recommend that because it doesn't necessarily sound as natural, and it certainly takes way longer to edit. But if you want to make your delegate sound more intelligent during an interview or something, just edit out all the ums. And if you do that, you'll actually get so good at recognizing what an looks like in Audacity that it'll be shorter. It'll be quicker than you think. Art asks, have there been any new nations that stand out to you? The answer is yes, actually. Give me a second, I'll look up their name. The name is Libertania Democratica. They get a shout out in this particular podcast. They are a nation who came into nation states during this recent surge of nations. I don't know if it was directly from a Drew-related video. I haven't actually asked, but it's pretty reasonable to assume. And I've been mentoring them for the last week or so on different ways that you can join the community here in the North Pacific, answering as many questions as they ask, and trying to just be as welcoming as possible. How did you promote the Drew invasion? Asks T. I don't know if we really promoted it. We didn't I guess if people asked, we would send them the video in question. Really, the thing is how did we take advantage of the surge of nations joining the North Pacific? And this isn't really a question so much for, I guess, so the Ministry of Radio did help because we had those tutorial videos that we had, and we saw a really big surge in viewership on those, so we probably helped people get more acquainted to nation states. The second thing is that we happened, entirely coincidentally, to be hosting our Security Counselor Week during the same period when we saw the biggest surge of new nations, and we were able to take advantage of getting as many of those new nations to become WA members and endorse our security counselors, in part, and not entirely because, but in part because we had done a series of interviews of our different security counselors. I think we had 3 of them on. I was one of them. And we saw a certain number of people watch those videos as well. Now, I'm not sure if those were all Drew nations. I think they were probably more established members of our community, but I think it probably helped. Felis2 asks, how do you deal with interviewees who have terrible audio quality? Is there a way to make it clearer in editing, or do you just have to go with it? So, I've definitely had this issue before. First off is boost their audio, their volume. Certain people come in super quiet, and if you can't hear them, people on YouTube aren't going to be able to either. So you can boost their volume. That's one thing that you can do. As far as background noise and grittiness, there are a number of filters that Audacity has that you can use to try to clean it up a little bit. But the problem is that if you have trash coming in, you're going to get trash coming out. And so you can try your best, but I mean, honestly, I have found that you want to get it as good as it can be on the way in. So if you ask, if you have to ask people to get a little closer to the mic, for instance, or if they happen to have a better microphone and get creative with that, so be it. Otherwise, I think you do sort of have to just go with it. I don't personally have the skills or the wherewithal or the time or the motivation, really, to deal with it. I'm sure someone who's more professional than myself could totally do it, but for an amateur podcaster like myself, I just find that it's best to try to improve their audio quality as much as possible before it's recorded. T asks, what is your retrospect or opinion about the Drew invasion or Drew endorsing nation states? I believe I have already answered this. Please clarify in more detail if it's a different question. But generally speaking, I think it's a good thing. Art asks, what advice would you say to other regions who are just about to start a podcast? Go for it. Don't worry so much about technical difficulties or if it works or not. Just start doing it, because the more you do it, the more experience you're going to get, the better it'll sound in the long term. The first ones are always shaky. They're always, fraught with the biggest challenges. And if you can push yourself over that first hill, you're going to find that it gets easier with time. So just try to get as much experience as you can. Don't worry about the sound quality. Don't worry about, pings irritating people. Just try to do the best that you can. And yeah, that's what I would say. So you say you use some sort of free use library for background music? And Dredton says YouTube and other sites have copyright-free music. And the answer is, yeah, that's true. YouTube actually has an audio library, not just of music, but all sorts of different background songs, or sounds that you can use entirely for free. Some of them do require that you give credit to whoever created that, and you just put it in your video description. But some of them don't, and you can just use it for free. There are whole websites out there dedicated to exactly that purpose. I personally use the YouTube one just because I know that it's that it's free to use, and I know that there's not going to be an issue with it. So I find that the YouTube one is pretty good. It's not terribly extensive, but it does work for the majority of the things that I'm trying to do. Koopa asks, has the Ministry of Radio, or yourself, ever done or considered doing podcasts with other regions? So we've done a number of podcasts with different events. I actually don't know if we did one in the Greater Dienstad joint NS roleplay conference. I don't actually know what that was called. I don't know if we did them for that. But basically, one of the things that I've been trying to promote within the Ministry of Radio is trying to do more of them going forward. I know that TEP has their basically TEP TV television. I don't actually know too much about it, but I've seen a number of their podcasts on YouTube as well. I have also seen Europia has an extensive Ministry of Radio that I have offered to do certain shows with in the past. Those never came to fruition, but I would definitely love to see more joint podcasts with other regions, both with regions that have established ministries of radio, and with other regions that are just getting started. And if you take my advice about the incredible potential that this has for your region, and you try to get this started, I will make myself available to you. If you have any questions, if you need any help with anything, feel free to reach out to me. I will do my best. Keep in mind, I do now have a job, so I won't be as available as most people, but I will try to do my all to help you out. And if you do want to do one of these joint shows, just reach out to either myself or Dredton or whoever the Ministry of Radio here in the North Pacific is, and I'm sure we'll try to make it happen. Art asks, what updates to nation states would you love to see? Wow, didn't expect that question. I'm pretty satisfied with nation states, but I'm also not like super. I haven't thought about this a lot. I guess one thing is I would really love to see greater diversity and greater frequency of events. Like we have N Day and Z Day, which occur pretty much annually now. Myself personally, having experienced those events several times now in the past, I would love to see either different events or just more events in total so that I don't have to wait until August or October or whatever it is for them to happen. If we could have them monthly or something, I think that could be really interesting. Of course, that takes so much more work on the part of the admins and moderators, so I understand why it doesn't happen. Not trying to diss on nation states at all, but I think that would be pretty cool. And yes, the East Pacific does have some sort of television. Let's try to get someone to post the link for that in the chat. Anyway, if no one has any other questions, I guess we'll be wrapping this up. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for participating by asking questions. And hopefully you'll take my advice and start some of these programs in your Pacific regions. If you have any need for help, just feel free to reach out at a later point, and I'll be happy to answer any more of your questions. Thanks!